The bells of St. Peter's Basilica toll softly over Rome, echoing across cobblestone streets as a slow-moving line of pilgrims, mourners, and faithful souls weaves its way through Vatican City. Their faces are heavy with reverence. Some hold rosaries, some hold tears. All hold a quiet, shared sorrow. Pope Francis, the man who had once breathed new life into an ancient office, has returned to God. Easter Monday, April 21st, 2025. The day the world stood still for a shepherd who refused to sit on a throne. The man who chose sandals over silk, gestures over grandness, and mercy over might. Now he lies in state beneath the magnificent dome of Michelangelo, beneath centuries of history. And yet somehow all eyes fall not on the grandeur of the basilica, but on the simple white garments of the man who lies in rest. A world leader in spirit, but a servant in heart. He never asked to be called His Holiness. He preferred Father. He refused the golden cross and chose iron. He refused the palatial residence and chose a small guest house. In a world obsessed with power, he modeled surrender. In an age of noise, he whispered truth. And in an era divided by borders, beliefs, and battle lines, he built bridges. But who was Pope Francis, really? He was Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a son of immigrants from Buenos Aires, Argentina. A teacher, a chemist, a priest. A man who had once swept the floors of a Jesuit seminary and later would walk the halls of the Vatican as Bishop of Rome. When he stepped out onto that balcony in 2013, the world expected politics and performance. Instead, they found a grandfatherly figure, shy and steady, who bowed his head and simply asked for prayer. Over the next decade, his quiet revolution would inspire millions. And now, we look back. Not with spectacle, but with sacred remembrance. What did he stand for? What did he fight for? What did he teach us about leadership, about love, and about legacy? Before we begin this journey through the life and impact of Pope Francis, I invite you to take a breath with me. A moment of stillness. Whether you're Catholic, Christian, or simply curious, this is a story about humanity, about hope, about what it means to lead not with authority, but with humility. And if this story touches you, if something in it moves your heart, consider sharing it. Leave a thought or a prayer in the comments. Let's make this more than just a video. Let it be a tribute, a conversation, a light. Now, let us remember the man who reminded us all that greatness begins with kneeling. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio became Pope Francis in March of 2013, the world was watching, though few knew what to expect. He stepped onto the Vatican balcony with no lavish fanfare, no grand gestures, just a quiet demeanor and a simple greeting. Buonasera. Good evening. That moment, subtle as it seemed, signaled something profound. Gone were the ornate vestments traditionally worn by new popes. In their place, plain white robes, an iron pectoral cross, and humility that was impossible to fake. Before blessing the world, he bowed and asked the world to bless him. It was not just a symbolic act, it was a paradigm shift. From the beginning, Pope Francis rejected the trappings of power. He refused the luxurious papal apartments in the Apostolic Palace and instead chose to live in a modest two-room suite in the Casa Santa Marta guest house. He often rode in a small Ford Focus rather than the papal limousine. These weren't just aesthetic choices. They were values in motion, visible signs that the papacy had taken a turn toward the people. He embodied what he often preached. Shepherds should smell like their sheep. And so he went out among them. In Rio de Janeiro, during World Youth Day, he mingled with crowds on the beaches, breaking security protocol to touch, bless, and listen. In Rome, He often snuck out at night to visit the homeless, dressed in plain clothes. In prisons, he washed the feet of inmates, including women and Muslims, on Holy Thursday. These weren't PR moments. They were acts of spiritual solidarity. He was not a pope sitting above the world, but one walking beside it. His face became familiar in slums and refugee camps, in hospitals and disaster zones. There was no pomp in his presence, only presence itself. He held the hands of the dying. He embraced children with disabilities. He wept with mothers who had lost sons in war. For Francis, proximity was theology. To serve Christ, he believed, was to serve the suffering. But beyond these gestures was a deeper message, one that resonated not just with Catholics, but with believers and skeptics alike. He reminded us that faith without compassion is empty, that leadership without service is hollow, that doctrines, no matter how ancient, must be lived out in the flesh and blood of everyday people. It wasn't always easy for the Church to adjust. Some welcomed his approach with open arms. Others, more cautious or traditional, hesitated. He understood the tension. Yet he pressed on, always gently, never forcefully, trusting that change doesn't come through edicts, but through example. In countless interviews, homilies, and spontaneous remarks, he re-centered the mission of the Church around mercy. He said the Church should be a field hospital after battle, not a courtroom for judgment. He told pastors to be close to their flocks, not trapped behind desks. He called for a revolution of tenderness, a phrase both radical and tender in a world often hardened by ideology. People saw in him not a perfect man, but a consistent one who struggled, who doubted, who bore the burden of leadership without losing his soul in it, one who spoke softly, but whose words carried the weight of the gospel. As we continue reflecting on his life, one thing becomes clear. Pope Francis didn't just tell us what to believe, he showed us how to live it. In every hospital room, in every prison cell, in every overlooked corner of society where he quietly knelt or gently touched a life, he left behind something more powerful than policy or proclamation. He left behind the example of a shepherd in simple shoes, who walked slowly enough for everyone to follow. As the world grew louder with conflict, Pope Francis's voice often stood out, not because it was the most forceful, but because it carried the weight of compassion in a time of cruelty. He did not need to raise his voice to be heard. He spoke softly, persistently, and always on behalf of those who could not speak for themselves. From the earliest days of his papacy, he stepped into the global stage not as a political leader, but as a moral one. He refused to align himself with powers or empires. Instead, he aligned himself with people, with the victims of war, the forgotten migrants, and those living in the shadow of violence and injustice. He called for an end to war in Syria long before the world took notice. He pleaded for diplomacy in Ukraine when others were escalating rhetoric. He prayed for peace in the Holy Land with Jewish and Muslim leaders by his side. At every opportunity, he reminded world leaders that war is always a failure, of politics, of humanity, of morality. In 2022, when the war in Ukraine intensified, Francis made one of his boldest symbolic gestures. He walked alone through the Colosseum on Good Friday, meditating on the Stations of the Cross while women from Ukraine and Russia read prayers together. It wasn't universally praised. Some called it too political, too optimistic. But for him, it wasn't about optics. It was about witness, about planting a seed of peace where none had yet bloomed. He frequently reminded the world that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. He addressed the arms trade with unflinching words, asking why so many economies were built on weapons, not food. He urged nations to welcome refugees, not out of obligation, but out of shared humanity. Each one of them, he said, has a name, a face, a story. Francis knew that peace must be built not only through treaties, but through encounter. He made history by traveling to the Arabian Peninsula in 2019 and signing the document on human fraternity with Grand Imam Ahmed el-Tayeb. The image of the two embracing, Christian and Muslim, Pope and Imam, was a powerful declaration that faiths need not fuel division. They can become bridges. His efforts in interfaith dialogue were not surface-level gestures. He formed genuine friendships with leaders from Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and beyond. He believed the heart of religion was not ritual, but relationship, first with God, then with each other. God is not the property of any one group, he once said. He is for all who seek him with sincere hearts. And perhaps most moving of all was his final Easter message in 2025. Delivered from a fragile frame, his voice softer than it once was, but no less determined. In it, he pleaded not for tradition or doctrine, but for peace, for the children caught in conflict, for the elders abandoned by war, for a world that had become numb to suffering. We have forgotten how to weep, he said. Let us weep again, so that we may heal again. Those words echoed across continents, played on radio stations, and whispered in churches, as if the world collectively sensed this might be his last public prayer. And it was. Now, in his absence, those words feel even more prophetic. Pope Francis may have left the world stage, but the world he dreamed of remains within reach, if only we are brave enough to carry his message forward, not just with our voices, but with our choices, not only in cathedrals, but in living rooms, in refugee camps, on city streets, in conversations we're afraid to start. Peace was not an ideal for him. It was a daily calling, a discipline, a vocation, and in a world on fire, that calling now belongs to us. Pope Francis was often described as gentle, kind, humble, but behind that soft demeanor lived a remarkable strength, an unwavering courage to confront what was broken, even when it came from within the very institution he led. He did not arrive at the papacy with illusions. He knew the Catholic Church was burdened by scandals, divided by ideologies, and in desperate need of healing. And yet, instead of guarding its image, he chose to uncover its wounds. He believed the Church's credibility would not be restored by silence or secrecy, but by truth. From the beginning, he prioritized action on the sexual abuse crisis, one of the Church's deepest and most painful failings. He met with survivors, not in grand public ceremonies, but in private, tearful conversations. He listened. He wept. And then he began the work, establishing new accountability mechanisms, removing bishops who had covered up abuse, and opening the Vatican's once untouchable archives to civil investigators. But he didn't stop there. He called out clericalism, the culture within the Church that had placed priests on pedestals and created a toxic environment of untouchability. The Church is not an elite of priests and bishops, he said. It is the faithful people of God. In doing so, he shifted the focus from hierarchy to community, from power to pastoral care. He also took bold stands on social issues that had long been treated with silence or rigidity. On LGBTQ+ individuals, his now famous phrase, "Who am I to judge?" became a turning point. Though church doctrine did not change overnight, his words opened doors. They sparked conversation. They made room for compassion where there had once been condemnation. He did not please everyone. In fact, his willingness to speak plainly, to soften the tone of ancient teachings, drew criticism from both sides. Some conservatives accused him of diluting doctrine. Some progressives claimed he didn't go far enough. But Francis seemed undeterred by either group. He wasn't trying to win applause. He was trying to keep the church rooted in the gospel. One of his most groundbreaking documents, Laudato Si', placed him at the center of global environmental discourse. In it, he framed climate change not just as a scientific issue, but a deeply spiritual one. He wrote not only to Catholics, but to every person living on this planet. He called the earth our common home, and he asked us to care for it as an act of faith. The cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, he said, are one and the same. It was a papal encyclical, unlike any before it, quoted by world leaders, scientists, and activists alike, and it challenged the faithful to expand their understanding of stewardship, not just of money or tradition, but of ecosystems, resources, and the lives of future generations. Francis also wasn't afraid to speak plainly about economic injustice. He criticized unrestrained capitalism and the dehumanizing effects of a system that placed profit above people. An economy that kills, he called it. He reminded the world that the dignity of the worker was more important than the bottom line, and that wealth should serve humanity, not dominate it. Yet, even when he spoke strongly, he never lost sight of grace. He offered correction with tenderness, disagreement with dignity. He did not preach down from a pulpit. He sat beside those he challenged. He was a reformer not because he was angry with the church, but because he loved it enough to risk discomfort, to bring it closer to Christ. There were moments he seemed tired, frustrated, lonely in his convictions, but still he moved forward. Like a farmer tending stubborn soil, he planted the seeds of transformation, knowing full well he might never see the harvest. And now, as we reflect on his passing, we begin to see the early fruit of his labor: a church more transparent, a priesthood more aware, a laity more engaged, conversations once hushed, now spoken aloud, questions once feared, now welcomed. Francis did not aim to destroy traditions. He aimed to return them to their roots, to restore the original fire of the gospel, the fire that speaks of love over law, mercy over judgment, truth over comfort. He challenged us, gently but firmly, to live what we profess. And in doing so, he reminded the world that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a white cassock, speaks in a soft voice, and never stops calling us higher. In a world fractured by difference, political, cultural, religious, Pope Francis emerged not as a divider, but as a builder, a bridge builder. That is, in fact, what the word pontiff means. And few lived up to that name as fully as he did. Throughout his papacy, Francis extended his arms beyond the boundaries of belief, nationality, and even historical resentment. He saw the growing polarization not only in the secular world, but within the church itself. And rather than taking sides, he chose to sit in the uncomfortable middle, the space where dialogue happens, where healing begins. He once said, "Unity does not mean uniformity. It does not imply doing everything together or thinking in the same way. It is the richness and the beauty of diversity reconciled by the Holy Spirit." That vision of unity became one of his deepest missions. Nowhere was this more evident than in his commitment to interfaith relationships. He met with rabbis, imams, patriarchs, monks, and ministers from across the world, not in ceremonial distance, but in genuine brotherhood. He prayed alongside leaders of Islam, embraced Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, and visited sacred sites of Buddhism and Hinduism with reverence and awe. In 2019, his visit to the United Arab Emirates was not just historic, it was transformative. It marked the first time a pope had ever set foot on the Arabian Peninsula. There, he co-signed the document on human fraternity with Grand Imam Ahmed el-Tayeb, declaring a shared commitment to peace, coexistence, and mutual respect. It wasn't a theological compromise, it was a human one. a commitment to recognize the image of God in each person, regardless of creed. He also played a vital role in mending decades-old rifts between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. In 2016, he met with Patriarch Kirill of Moscow in Havana, the first meeting between a pope and a Russian Orthodox patriarch in nearly 1,000 years. Their embrace made headlines, but the moment's true power was in its symbolism, that ancient wounds can begin to heal with a handshake. Even within the Catholic Church, he worked tirelessly to unite those on opposite ends of belief and practice. He welcomed the traditional Latin Mass communities while also calling for inclusion and reform. He invited cardinals from every continent into positions of influence, reshaping the College of Cardinals into a more global and diverse body. Under his leadership, the Vatican began to look less like a European court and more like a worldwide church. And yet, he never pretended this work was easy. He admitted that dialogue is messy, that listening can be exhausting, that misunderstanding is inevitable. But he never saw disagreement as defeat. Dialogue, he said, is the path to peace. Even if we do not agree, we must walk together. In a world obsessed with being right, Pope Francis showed us the holiness of simply being present, of choosing understanding over accusation, encounter over avoidance. In his presence, even political rivals found common ground. Even atheists found admiration. Because at the heart of it all was not a message of superiority, but of shared humanity. One of the most powerful images of his pontificate came not from a cathedral or conference, but from a moment on a rainy night in March 2020. Alone in St. Peter's Square, surrounded by silence, he prayed for the world as the pandemic raged. No crowd, no choir, just a frail figure in white under an umbrella, lifting the whole of humanity in prayer. That moment reminded us all. We are fragile, we are connected, and we need each other more than we think. Francis believed bridges could be built anywhere, between religions, between nations, between hearts. And while many of those bridges are still incomplete, the blueprints are there, laid out in his actions, inscribed in his words, waiting now for us to finish the work. His passing has left an emptiness, yes, but also an open space, a space where dialogue can continue, where unity, not conformity, can flourish, where we remember that love, true love, does not erase difference, but embraces it. And in that embrace, we see a glimpse of the kingdom he always pointed to. Not just the church on earth, but the family of God in its fullest, widest, most beautiful form. Now, as the bells of St. Peter's Basilica toll once more and thousands line up to pay their respects, the world pauses to remember a man whose quiet strength left a thunderous impact. Pope Francis may have breathed his last on Easter Monday, but the breath of his vision continues to stir hearts across every continent. It is tempting, in moments like these, to close the story, to speak of legacy as something finished, carved in marble and sealed in history. But Francis never lived with the illusion that the work was his alone, or that it ended with him. In his final years, he prepared the world for what would come after, not with grandeur, but with seeds. Seeds of compassion, seeds of courage, seeds of change, and now it is our turn to nurture them. His legacy is not a monument, it is a movement. You see it in the parish priest who listens more than he lectures, in the young woman who dares to speak truth in a room that tells her to stay silent, in the refugee welcomed by a stranger's outstretched hand, in the atheist who says, "I don't believe, but I respected him." You see it in the Vatican's new appointments, more diverse, more global, more reflective of the Church Universal. You see it in every child who learns that faith is not a weapon, but a light. In every classroom that reads Laudato Si as part of a science curriculum. in every conversation between people who once feared each other but now choose to walk together. But perhaps his greatest legacy lies not in policy or popularity, but in posture. He knelt, constantly, before the poor, before the sick, before the broken, before the cross. He reminded us by example that leadership without humility is just power, and power without love becomes tyranny. He showed that faith is strongest not when shouted, but when lived, when it feeds the hungry, forgives the enemy, listens to the doubter, and holds the wounded. His very first words as Pope were, "Pray for me," and his last public act was a prayer for the world. He began with humility and ended with service, just as he always intended. And now, what remains is a call, not to venerate him but to imitate him, to take up his cross, not as a burden, but as a mission, to be bridge builders, peacemakers, truth-tellers, and hope-bringers in a world desperate for all four. It is easy to feel overwhelmed, to wonder, can one person really make a difference in such a broken world? Pope Francis answered that not with argument, but with his life. One man, one voice, one heart on fire with love. And look what that became. So let us not simply remember Pope Francis, let us continue him. In our homes, by choosing kindness. In our churches, by choosing inclusion. In our politics, by choosing justice. In our daily lives, by choosing mercy over resentment, presence over distraction, humility over pride. The world changed because of him. Let it keep changing because of us. And one day, when our own time comes to leave this earth, may it be said of us what we now say of him. He walked with the lowly. He spoke for the voiceless. He loved with a fearless heart. And he never gave up on the dream that we could all be one. Rest in peace, Pope Francis. And thank you for showing us the way.